The ranch sat far away from anything that could be called a town. It stretched across wide fields of dry grass, scattered oak trees, and dusty fences that creaked whenever the wind passed through them. Once it had been a place filled with warmth, laughter, and the sound of a woman singing softly while working on the porch. Now it was silent in a way that felt heavy, almost like the land itself was mourning. Inside the old wooden house at the center of the property, a widowed rancher named Caleb lived with his newborn daughter. Only a few months ago, his life had been completely different. He had a wife, a partner who understood the rhythm of the ranch better than anyone. She had been strong, kind, and full of plans for the future. They had dreamed about raising their child together, teaching her how to walk barefoot on warm soil, how to recognize animals by their sounds, and how to find joy in simple things. But fate had taken those plans away in a single, cruel moment during childbirth. Caleb had lost his wife before he even had the chance to introduce her properly to their daughter. Since that day, the house had never felt the same. The kitchen, where she used to prepare meals, now stood untouched. Her favorite chair by the window gathered dust. Even the wind chimes she once loved seemed to sound more like sorrow than music. Caleb was not prepared for fatherhood. He had worked ranch life all his life, caring for cattle, repairing fences, surviving storms, but nothing in his experience had taught him how to care for a fragile newborn. His hands, once confident and steady, now trembled whenever he held his daughter. Every cry from the small crib felt like a test he was failing. He named her Lily because his wife had once said it was a flower that meant renewal and hope. But right now, hope felt distant. Lily was so small that she could fit entirely in the curve of his arm. Her skin was delicate, her eyes still adjusting to the world, and her cries were soft but urgent. At first, Caleb tried everything he could think of. He followed instructions from a distant doctor over the telephone. He heated milk, cooled it, changed bottles, adjusted positions. Nothing seemed right. The nights were the hardest. When the wind howled outside, it sounded almost like the land was echoing his loneliness. He would sit in a rocking chair near the fire, holding Lily against his chest, trying to calm her while his mind spiraled with worry. Sleep became rare. His meals became forgotten. Time itself seemed to blur into a continuous loop of exhaustion and fear. Lately, things had become worse. Lily had begun refusing milk entirely. At first, it was just small changes, hesitation during feeding, turning her head away. But soon she stopped feeding altogether. Her cries became weaker and her tiny body seemed to lose strength. Caleb noticed the way her hands didn't move as actively, the way her eyes didn't stay open as long. Panic started to settle into his chest like a stone he couldn't remove. He walked the ranch during the day holding her close, hoping the fresh air might help. He checked the barn repeatedly, as if the answer to his problem might somehow be hiding there among the hay and tools. He even tried singing softly, though his voice cracked every time he did. The sound reminded him too much of his wife, and that memory was both comforting and painful at the same time. The isolation of the ranch made everything harder. There were no neighbors nearby to call easily, no family living close enough to help in the middle of the night. The vastness that once felt peaceful now felt like a trap. Caleb began to realize how alone he truly was. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in shades of orange and gold, Caleb stood outside the house holding Lily in his arms. The wind moved gently through the grass, and for a moment, everything felt still. But Lily gave a faint, weak cry again, and that fragile sound broke whatever calm remained inside him. He looked toward the horizon, feeling a deep helplessness. He was a rancher who could mend fences, guide cattle, survive storms, but he could not save his own child from fading away. And that thought scared him more than anything he had ever faced in his life. That was the moment when everything began to change, though he didn't know it yet. The days that followed brought no relief, only growing fear. Caleb could feel it in the way the house changed around him. It was not something he could easily explain, but everything seemed heavier, slower, and more uncertain. The ticking of the old wall clock sounded louder at night. The floorboards creaked like they were carrying extra weight. Even the light coming through the windows felt dull, as if the world outside had lost some of its color. But nothing weighed more heavily on him than Lily. She was still so small, yet her weakness had become impossible to ignore. At first, Caleb had told himself it was just a phase, something newborns went through. But deep down, a quiet panic was beginning to take root. Lily was not feeding properly anymore. Each attempt felt like a battle neither of them was winning. He tried everything he could think of again and again, refusing to believe he was running out of options. He adjusted the formula carefully, measuring it twice with shaking hands. He warmed it to the exact temperature the doctor had mentioned over the phone. He even tried different feeding positions, gently rocking her in his arms while whispering soft, broken reassurances that sounded more like prayers than confidence. But Lily would only turn her head away. Sometimes she would cry weakly, as if she still wanted to try but didn't have the strength. Other times, she would simply stare with tired eyes, her tiny body resting against him without resistance. That silence was worse than the crying. It made Caleb feel like he was already losing her piece by piece. He began to lose track of time. Morning and night blurred together. He would sit in the same chair for hours holding her, waiting for her to wake, waiting for her to feed, waiting for anything to change. The ranch work that once defined his life was now completely neglected. The cattle wandered with less attention. The fences he once took pride in were left half-repaired. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the baby in his arms. Caleb's mind started replaying memories he couldn't escape. He thought of his wife often now, more than ever before. He remembered how easily she had handled newborn animals on the ranch, how she had once joked that she had a natural instinct for anything small and helpless. He wished, painfully, that she was still there. She would have known what to do. She would have known how to fix this. But she wasn't there. One night, during a particularly cold evening, Caleb sat by the fireplace with Lily wrapped tightly in a blanket. The fire crackled softly, but even its warmth couldn't ease the tension in the room. Lily let out a faint cry, barely audible. It was weaker than before, almost like a whisper. Caleb immediately tried feeding her again, but she refused, turning her face away with a tired movement. That moment broke something inside him. He held her closer, pressing his forehead gently against hers, as if he could somehow transfer strength into her fragile body. "Please," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to her, to himself, or to something greater. "Just eat, just a little," but there was no response. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The sound reminded him of how isolated they were, just him, the baby, and miles of empty land. If something went wrong now, there would be no one nearby to help quickly. That thought made his chest tighten. He began to notice other small but terrifying signs. Lily's skin looked paler than before. Her movements were slower. She slept longer, but it didn't feel restful. Every instinct Caleb had told him something was seriously wrong, even if he didn't have the knowledge to understand exactly what it was. He tried calling the doctor again, but the line was unreliable out in the ranch. When he finally got through, the advice was the same: try different feeding methods, keep her warm, monitor her closely. But none of it felt enough anymore. Caleb started to feel helpless in a way he had never experienced before. On the ranch, problems always had solutions. Broken fences could be repaired. Sick cattle could be treated. Storm damage could be rebuilt. But this was different. This was his child slipping away while he stood there unable to stop it. That realization haunted him. By the end of the week, he barely slept. He would sit in the rocking chair with Lily resting against him, afraid to put her down in case something changed while he wasn't watching. His eyes grew tired, his body weak, but he refused to let go. And yet, despite all his effort, Lily only grew quieter. The ranch, once a place of strength for him, now felt like a prison of uncertainty. The silence outside seemed to press against the walls, reminding him that he was alone in this fight and losing it slowly. That was when, far beyond his awareness, something unexpected was already beginning to move closer to his life. On the edge of the same wide countryside, just a stretch of fields away, lived a young woman named Eliza. Her small farmhouse wasn't far from Caleb's ranch, though the distance felt larger than it truly was. Life in that region was quiet and simple, shaped by early mornings, hard work, and long evenings that faded into golden sunsets. Eliza was used to the sounds of rural life, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through dry grass, and the occasional rumble of a passing wagon. But over the past few days, she had started noticing something unusual. It began with silence. Not the normal kind of silence that came with nightfall, but something different, an absence where there used to be life. Caleb's ranch, which she could usually see in the distance with smoke rising from the chimney or movement around the barn, had become strangely still. No smoke in the mornings, no activity near the fences, no faint sounds of work that usually carried across the fields. At first, she tried to ignore it. Ranchers had quiet days. People got busy. Life moved unpredictably. But something about it kept tugging at her attention. Then came the sound. One evening, while tending to her own animals near the fence line, Eliza heard it faintly on the wind, a baby's cry. It was weak, uneven, almost swallowed by the breeze. It didn't sound like the usual cries of a healthy infant. It sounded tired, fragile, like it didn't have much strength left behind it. She stopped what she was doing immediately. Her eyes lifted toward Caleb's ranch in the distance. The sky was turning orange, and the long shadows of the fields stretched between their properties like quiet lines connecting two separate lives. She stood still for a long moment, listening carefully. The sound came again, softer this time. Something didn't feel right. Eliza knew Caleb in a distant, neighborly way. They had exchanged brief greetings before simple nods, short conversations about weather or livestock. He was polite but reserved, especially since his wife's passing. Everyone in the area knew about the tragedy. It had been spoken about, quietly, respectfully, as people in rural places often do when grief settles into someone's life. But Eliza also knew something else. Caleb had a newborn, and now, the silence of the ranch combined with the faint cries she kept hearing made her uneasy. Over the next 2 days, she paid closer attention. Every morning, she checked in the direction of the ranch while doing her chores. Every evening, she paused longer than usual, listening beyond the wind. And each time, she noticed the same pattern: no visible activity and the occasional weak sound of a baby carried on the air. Her concern grew heavier. One afternoon, as she walked along the fence line carrying feed for her chickens, she finally saw Caleb. He was outside the house, holding something close to his chest. Even from a distance, she could see his posture, slouched, tired, almost overwhelmed. He moved slowly, like someone carrying a weight that couldn't be put down. And in his arms, she saw the small bundle of a baby. The sight stayed with her long after she went back inside her home. That night, Eliza couldn't sleep easily. She kept thinking about what she had seen. Caleb looked exhausted in a way she recognized, not just physically tired, but emotionally drained. The kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long without help. And the baby, something about the baby worried her most. The way it didn't move much. The way Caleb held it so carefully, almost protectively, as if afraid to let go even for a second. By the next morning, her decision had already formed in her mind, though she still hesitated. It wasn't her place to interfere. People valued privacy, especially in difficult times. But something about this felt different. It didn't feel like simple grief anymore. It felt like someone struggling alone when they didn't have to be. So she waited one more day. That evening, as the wind picked up and dark clouds rolled in over the fields, Eliza stood at her window and looked toward the ranch again. There were no lights outside, no movement near the barn, only the faint glow of a lamp inside the house. And then she heard it again, the baby's cry, even weaker than before. That was the moment she could no longer ignore it. She grabbed her shawl, stepped outside into the cooling air, and began walking across the field. Each step felt uncertain, but her resolve held steady. She didn't know exactly what she would say when she arrived. She didn't know how Caleb would react. But she knew one thing clearly. Someone needed help over there, and she was going to find out if she could offer it. The wind had turned sharper by the time Eliza reached the edge of Caleb's property. The sky was heavy with low, gray clouds, the kind that promised rain but hadn't yet decided when to fall. The fields between the two homes felt longer than they ever had before, as if each step carried extra weight. Eliza slowed near the gate. For a moment she hesitated. It was easy to stand on her own land and worry from a distance. It was much harder to cross into someone else's grief. In rural places, people respected boundaries. They didn't interfere unless invited. But what she had been hearing, and what she had seen, no longer felt like something she could ignore. A faint sound broke through the wind again, a baby's cry. Weak, tired, almost fading, that sound pushed her forward. She opened the gate carefully, making sure it didn't creak too loudly, and walked up the dirt path leading to the ranch house. The place looked worn, more than she remembered. The porch light flickered slightly, and the wooden steps were dusty, as if they hadn't been swept in days. She stopped at the door. For a few seconds she just listened. Inside there was movement. Slow footsteps, then silence. Then the soft sound of something being rocked. A baby's faint whimper followed. Eliza raised her hand and knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet house. Nothing happened at first. She waited, unsure if she should knock again. Then finally, she heard footsteps approaching, slow, heavy, like the person on the other side was carrying more than just exhaustion. The door opened. Caleb stood there. Up close, he looked worse than she had expected. His face was pale, shadowed by fatigue. His eyes carried a constant tension, as if he hadn't fully rested in days. His shirt was wrinkled, his sleeves rolled up without care. And in his arms, wrapped tightly in a thin blanket, was the baby. Eliza immediately noticed how small the child looked. Too still, too quiet between faint sounds of discomfort. Caleb's gaze narrowed slightly when he saw her. Not unkindly, but cautiously. He wasn't used to visitors anymore. Especially not unexpected ones. "Eliza?" he said, recognizing her after a moment. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much. She nodded gently. I'm sorry to come without warning." A brief silence passed between them, filled only by the soft sound of the baby's breathing. Caleb shifted slightly, protective, instincts tightening his hold. "Is something wrong?" Eliza hesitated. She didn't want to sound intrusive, but she also couldn't pretend she hadn't noticed. "I've been hearing her," she said carefully. "From my place. She sounds weak." Caleb's expression changed immediately. Not anger, but exhaustion mixed with worry. The kind of expression that came from someone who already knew the answer but was afraid to admit it. "I'm trying," he said quietly. "I've tried everything. She won't feed properly." "I don't know what I'm doing wrong?" His voice cracked. Slightly at the end, Eliza looked at the baby again. She could see it more clearly now, the way the infant's movements were slow, the way its cries were faint instead of strong. It wasn't just a tired baby. It was a baby that needed care it wasn't getting. "I'm not here to judge you," she said softly, "but I think she needs help." Caleb tightened his jaw, torn between pride and desperation. He looked down at his daughter, then back at Eliza. "I don't have anyone else," he admitted. "It's just me." Those words carried something heavy. Not just loneliness, but responsibility pressed too hard on one person's shoulders. Eliza stepped slightly closer, her voice gentle but steady. "Then let me help. Just let me try feeding her. I've done it before. I know a few things that might make her more comfortable." Caleb didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched. The wind outside pushed lightly against the porch, rattling the edges of the wooden frame. Inside the house, the baby made another weak sound, barely a cry, more like a plea. That sound broke something in Caleb's hesitation. He looked at Eliza. Again, really looked at her this time. She wasn't demanding anything. She wasn't judging him. She was just standing there, offering help. Finally, he exhaled slowly. "I don't know if it'll work," he said. "That's okay," Eliza replied. Let me try anyway. A long pause followed. Then, carefully, Caleb stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, quietly. And as Eliza stepped into the warm, dimly lit house, neither of them knew yet that this simple moment, this single knock on a worn wooden door, was about to change everything that followed. The rain finally arrived that night, tapping softly against the windows of the ranch house. It was not a storm, just a steady, gentle rainfall that washed over the dry fields outside. The sound might have felt peaceful under different circumstances, but inside Caleb's home, it only deepened the quiet intensity of what had just happened. Lily was no longer crying. That alone felt unreal to Caleb. He stood a few steps away from Eliza, watching as she carefully held his daughter. The baby had stopped feeding for the moment and was now resting, her tiny body calmer than it had been in days. Her breathing, while still fragile, seemed steadier. The change was small, but to Caleb it felt enormous. He had been bracing himself for bad news for so long that even a moment of improvement felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, like something he wasn't allowed to trust yet. Eliza gently adjusted the blanket around Lily, making sure she stayed warm. Her movements were calm and practiced, not rushed, not uncertain. She didn't treat the baby like a problem to fix quickly, but like something delicate that needed time. Caleb watched silently, absorbing every detail. After a while, he spoke quietly. "She's really better right now." Eliza nodded. "She's calmer, that's a good sign. But she still needs care over time. This isn't a one-time fix." He looked down at his hands. They were still slightly trembling. "I thought I was doing everything right." Eliza didn't respond immediately. She chose her words carefully. "You were trying alone, that's different." The honesty in her voice didn't feel harsh. It felt grounded, real. Caleb let out a slow breath and sank into the chair beside him. For days, he had been operating on pure survival feeding attempts, sleepless nights, constant worry. Now, with a small moment of stability in the room, exhaustion finally caught up to him. "I didn't know what I was doing," he admitted quietly. "After my wife, I just had to figure it out on my own." The mention of his wife hung in the air between them. Eliza looked down for a moment, respectful of the weight behind his words. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Caleb shook his head slightly. "I keep thinking I should be able to handle it. This is my ranch, my daughter. I'm supposed to know how to take care of things." Eliza shifted slightly in her chair, still holding Lily securely. "There's a difference between knowing how to run a ranch and knowing how to care for a newborn alone." That truth landed quietly but clearly. Caleb didn't argue. He couldn't. Instead, he looked at Lily again. "She reacted to you immediately," he said. "She didn't react like that with me." Eliza glanced up. "Babies don't always respond to strength. Sometimes they respond to calm, familiarity, patience." A pause followed. Then she added gently, "And sometimes they respond better when someone else steps in for a moment. It doesn't mean you're failing her." Those words seemed to loosen something in Caleb's expression. Not fully, but enough to ease the sharp edge of guilt he had been carrying. He leaned back slightly, exhaling. "I didn't want help," he admitted. "Not because I don't need it, but because I didn't want to admit I couldn't do it alone." Eliza nodded slowly, understanding without judgment. Most people don't want to admit that. Another quiet moment passed. The only sounds were the rain outside and the soft movement of Lily's breathing. Then Eliza spoke again, more practically this time. "I can come by in the mornings, if you'll let me. Just to check on her, make sure she keeps improving." Caleb looked at her, surprised. "You do that?" "I wouldn't have come here if I didn't mean it," she replied simply. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to understand her presence in his life. She had crossed fields, entered his home, and stepped into his most vulnerable situation without asking for anything in return. That wasn't something he was used to anymore. Finally, he nodded. "I'd appreciate that." The words felt small but sincere. Eliza offered a faint, reassuring smile. "Then we'll take it one step at a time." Caleb watched as she carefully rocked Lily again. The baby stirred slightly but remained calm, no longer struggling the way she had been before. Something inside Caleb shifted again, this time more clearly. Not just relief, but a quiet sense of trust beginning to form. Not complete, not immediate, but real enough to notice. For the first time since his wife's passing, he wasn't facing everything alone. And for the first time since Eliza had arrived, she wasn't just a stranger at the door anymore. She was becoming part of the story he didn't know he needed yet. Weeks turned into a gentle rhythm on the ranch, as if life itself had finally decided to settle into place again. The mornings no longer began with panic. Caleb would wake to the soft sounds of the wind moving through the fields and, more importantly, the steady breathing of his daughter. Lily's cries still came, but they were no longer weak or distress-filled. They were normal, healthy, even demanding in the way all babies eventually become when they start to grow stronger. The change was slow, but undeniable. Eliza's visits continued, though they no longer felt like visits in the same way. She came and went with ease now, sometimes bringing small homemade remedies, sometimes simply checking on Lily before heading back to her own work. The distance between the two properties felt shorter than it ever had before, not physically, but in spirit. Caleb had also changed. He no longer stood helplessly by, watching from a distance. He learned, he practiced. He made mistakes and corrected them. And most importantly, he no longer rejected help when it came. What once felt like weakness now felt like responsibility shared. One bright morning, Eliza arrived to find Caleb outside, holding Lily carefully while walking slowly along the porch. The baby was alert now, her eyes following movement, her small hands reaching toward the sunlight filtering through the air. "She's getting curious," Eliza said with a small smile. Caleb looked down at his daughter and gave a soft, almost disbelieving laugh. "She's getting strong-willed," he replied. Eliza stepped closer, watching Lily stretch her fingers toward the open sky. "That's a good sign." Caleb nodded, but his eyes lingered a little longer on Eliza this time. "I don't think she'd be here like this without you," he said quietly. Eliza shook her head. "She would have." "You didn't give up on her." "I almost did," he admitted. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable but reflective. Then Eliza said gently, "You didn't. You just didn't have anyone standing beside you when you needed it most." Those words stayed in the air for a moment longer than the others. Caleb looked toward the fields, then back at his daughter. "I used to think this place was enough on its own," he said. "The ranch, the work, I thought that was all I needed." Eliza listened quietly. "But it wasn't," he continued. "Not anymore." Over time, something subtle had begun to change between them. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It grew in quiet conversations, shared responsibilities, and the simple act of showing up for each other without being asked. Eliza no longer felt like an outsider stepping into someone else's life. She had become part of the daily rhythm of the ranch. Caleb no longer felt like a man carrying everything alone. And Lily was the center of it all, the small life that had brought them together in the first place. One afternoon, as golden light spread across the fields, Eliza sat on the porch steps while Caleb rocked Lily gently in his arms. The baby was calm, her eyes half closed, resting against her father's chest. The world felt unusually peaceful. Caleb broke the silence softly. "You ever think about how strange it is," he said, "that something so small can change everything?" Eliza looked at Lily and smiled faintly. "All the time." He nodded slowly. "Before you came, I thought I had already lost everything worth holding on to." Eliza didn't respond immediately. She simply watched the way Lily's tiny hand curled around Caleb's finger. After a moment, she said, "You were just in a place where you couldn't see forward yet." Caleb looked at her then, not just as a neighbor, not just as someone who helped, but as someone who had become essential in ways he hadn't fully understood before. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of everything they hadn't said out loud yet. As the sun began to dip lower, painting the ranch in warm tones of gold and amber, Lily let out a soft content sound and drifted deeper into sleep. Caleb held her closer. "I don't want things to go back to how they were," he said quietly. Eliza stood slowly, brushing dust from her skirt. She looked at him for a long moment before replying. They won't, she said. Because you're not the same man who opened that door a few weeks ago? He gave a faint, tired smile. And you're not just a neighbor anymore? Eliza met his gaze, and for a moment neither of them needed to explain what that meant. The ranch, once filled with silence and grief, now carried something new: life, healing, and a quiet bond built not from perfect circumstances, but from shared struggle and unexpected compassion. And as evening settled over the fields, it was clear that this was not an ending. It was the beginning of something they were only just learning how to name.